Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, we're jumping back into the Answers in Genesis Canada catalog because, while they have tricked me into responding to the same video twice by re-uploading it with a different thumbnail and title in the past, I am certain that I haven't responded to this one before, as I'd remember having seen Calvin surrounding himself with piles and piles of books like he has in this one. This one is called I Studied Evolution in Depth, Here's Why I Don't Believe in It. And what's great is that the piles of books are clearly meant to indicate just how much material he has read about evolution as part of his in-depth study, and the books whose titles you can see are related to evolution. We've got a book on fossils, another book called Evolution a couple layers higher, can't quite make out the book in between the two. Above that we have The Chronicle of the World, which is a brief summary of all of human history. It's about 1,200 pages long, a length which makes it feel weird to describe it as brief, but as it covers all of human history going back to the evolution of humanity in the first place, squeezing all of that into a mere 1,200 pages is incredibly brief. And while it doesn't cover evolution in great detail, it does acknowledge it and talk about the initial publication of Origin of Species, so it's at least a little bit relevant. A bit higher up in the stack we have the 1922 book Evolution of Man by George Batesell, with Adam, Where Are You? And Why This Matters, a theological evaluation of the evolutionist hermeneutic on top of that one. On the other side we have Implications of Evolution by Kirkut and The Ascent of Man by Alfred Mansion, both resting on top of Answers in Genesis' own Answers Book 2, and so on. There's a few more, all something to do with evolution to some degree or other, and a mix of creationist tripe and actual serious works. Probably my favorite inclusion is Men Before Adam by Anne Terry White, because that book opens with the sentence, "An armchair anthropologist must of necessity lean on books, yet in a volume so informal of this," and so on. It opens with the author acknowledging that they are an outsider to the scientific field that she is discussing, and calling her book an informal volume. Undoubtedly the point of having all these books around is to impress you with the depth of the research that they've done for this video, but the amount of research that they actually did was so small that they couldn't avoid including their own book, books by other creationists, and a book by a self-proclaimed armchair anthropologist, and had to resort to having most of the books with their spines turned away from the camera, likely because they have nothing to do with the subject matter and are just there for the aesthetic. Well, two can play at that game.
All right, Calvin, let's do this.
One of the most common comments posted as a rebuttal to any one of our articles or videos is probably the statement, "You just don't understand evolution."
You know what? Even with all these books here, the desk is still missing a little something. There we go. Such a naive statement. A few years ago, I might have posted something similar, though I would likely have been inclined to hedge it a bit by saying you either don't understand it or you're a liar, but I've seen enough blatant dishonesty from the AIG crew at this point that today my comment would be more along the lines of you're just lying about evolution. And I suppose you could say that not everyone involved in the production process is necessarily lying about it. Some of them, I'm sure, don't understand it because they've never been exposed to anything other than what AIG says about it, but the people writing the scripts understand it enough to know exactly how it has to be misrepresented in order to push the AIG narrative properly. So yeah, they do understand it, they're just liars for Jesus.
Which, of course, is not really an argument, but simply an ad hominem, to-the-man fallacy that most often isn't really worthy of a specific response.
It's only fallacious if you're making the claim that someone is wrong because of an insult that you threw at them. But in this case, the perceived insult is actually directly related to the trustworthiness of the source. Let's walk it back from calling them liars for a moment and address what they are actually saying they see all the time. They just don't understand evolution. So, when Answers in Genesis puts out a video explaining why they think evolution isn't true, if the statement "you don't understand evolution" is a true statement, then that does, in fact, call into question the conclusions that AIG comes to in their video. For a topic as complex as evolution, you need to demonstrate that you actually do understand it if you want anyone to take you seriously when you present a supposed debunking of the whole shebang. But yeah, just saying you don't understand it without elaborating is unhelpful, to say the least. So let's elaborate, shall we?
However, to be honest, I have seen situations in which some fellow biblical creationists make statements that indicate they aren't particularly familiar with the exact mechanisms or nuances that evolution-believing scientists or even the average evolution believer might hold to.
I like how Calvin hedges that by saying he's seen biblical creationists do that, as though he weren't including himself in the category of creationists who do that. And if you want to see him doing that, I put together a handy little playlist that includes all of the videos I've ever made responding to Calvin. Well, I won't promise that I didn't miss one or two of them while scrolling, but most of them are definitely there. And let me tell you, it is full of Calvin putting his ignorance and/or dishonesty about evolution on full display. Everything from reading quotes out of context to make them look more damning than they are, to ignoring vast amounts of research, the very existence of which proves him wrong regardless of the outcome of the specific experiments in question, to misrepresenting the research that he does acknowledge, and more. One of the observations I've made on a number of occasions is that AIG as an organization seems to like to phrase things in its articles and videos in a way that's not technically wrong, but will definitely lead to misunderstandings among their audience. And that's actually why I'm comfortable calling the scriptwriters over at AIG liars rather than my usual hedging of saying that they are ignorant or don't understand. They have shown that they understand it at least well enough to frame things in a way to encourage common misunderstandings that are clearly flawed, but without technically falling into those misunderstandings themselves, giving them plausible deniability when it's pointed out that the arguments based on those misunderstandings are bad arguments. They now get to say, well, I never actually made that argument, so there, without actually removing or clarifying the material that led to the misunderstanding that allowed that argument to exist in the first place. A great example of this is in the video that's on the playlist that I just linked to called Creationists Don't Know What Analogies Are. In it, Calvin begins by presenting the evolution-believing commenters on their website as holding the common misconception that natural selection and evolution mean the same thing, resulting in arguments for evolution that rely on equivocation. He then goes on in the rest of the video to explain how a handful of examples of natural selection were either fraudulent or fairly minor changes, so clearly evolution is false, thus encouraging creationists to conflate natural selection with the whole of evolution, all while technically not actually having said that himself, and even explicitly stating the opposite once. It's more than a little bit slimy, to be honest.
For example, one of the most common I've seen is the question, well, if we evolved from apes, then why are there still apes around? Thrown at evolutionists dozens of times, and often with much gusto, as if the Christian believes that the question is such a zinger for the naturalist that it sounds as if the questioner expects the person to drop to their knees and accept Jesus on the spot.
And this is the easy let's avoid bad creationist arguments point for them to make in order to give them that sweet, sweet, plausible deniability that they love so much. But the fact that they have to keep repeating that as an example of a bad argument that is still used today, despite the fact that they are also the main source of information about evolution for most creationists, kind of shows how dedicated they aren't to presenting their case in a way that does not lend itself to misconceptions.
You see, evolutionists don't believe we evolved from apes. They believe we evolved from a common ancestor to both apes and humans.
And the misconceptions begin. For some reason, I fully expected him to say they believe we still are apes, because that would be a true statement. And while the statement he made is not technically untrue, we do have a common ancestor with the other apes, it is imprecise enough to leave people with a mistaken idea about what so-called evolutionists actually believe.
Of course, when you ask them what that creature would have resembled, they will most often say it was an ape-like creature. So, the thin slicing that's often involved in these respective explanations can be a little tricky for the average layperson to sort out.
And that leads right back into the why are there still apes misconception. No, they don't believe we evolved from apes, but a common ancestor that we share with apes, which is an ape-like creature. So basically, they believe we evolved from apes, with the unstated final question for creationists often being, then why are there still apes? The reason ape-like is used is to differentiate our common ancestor with the modern apes from the modern apes. We did not descend from any species that still exist today, so we need to differentiate from the ones that do exist today. There's also the fact that our last common ancestor with all of the apes as a group is not the same as our last common ancestor for any of the specific apes that do still exist today. Our last common ancestor with chimps was more recent than our one with gorillas, which was more recent than the one with orangutans, which was more recent than the one with gibbons. If you truly want to dispel the why are there still apes question, then do something like point out that nothing in evolution says that an ancestor species must go extinct before its descendants can take over. And you can make this abundantly obvious by pointing out things like, I, a Canadian, am of Scottish descent, but if I descended from Scottish people, why are there still Scottish people? Just treat it as being as ridiculous as it is, and then the rank and file creationists will stop using it as an argument eventually. But dismissing it and then immediately backtracking like you just did is the kind of behavior that keeps those kinds of arguments alive. And the fact that these are the sorts of tactics that professional creationist organizations have to rely on really speaks volumes about the quality, or lack thereof, of the more sophisticated arguments.
Regardless, the evolutionists have an answer to that question, which is why I tend to cringe a little when I see it lobbed at a skeptic, because it typically elicits an eye roll or a facepalm and reinforces the notion that creationists just don't understand evolution.
Yep. And your explanation as to why it's a bad argument reinforces the idea that you just don't understand evolution. Except you're in a position where you've been exposed to enough information about evolution that you should know better, which means you aren't just ignorant, you're lying.
And often with the implication that if they did understand it, they'd believe in it.
Indeed. I rejected it when what I knew about it came mostly from Answers in Genesis. Then, as I learned more about it, I started accepting it. Of course, this isn't the path that everyone takes. Some people can exist in a state of denial and cognitive dissonance for their entire lives. Often, that leads to behavior where they actively avoid learning more about a subject. They've learned enough to make them uncomfortable, but not enough to convince them otherwise, so they stop learning, lest the things that they learn convince them of a conclusion that they don't want to accept. I remember being in that place. It started with the stars. I have always loved astronomy, and I knew that stars existed that were billions of light years away. Eventually, I put 2 and 2 together and realized that for their light to reach us, the universe had to be billions of years old. The creationist explanations for distant starlight never really sat well with me for a number of reasons, so I never really came over to the side of young Earth creationism, but I wouldn't have called myself an old Earth creationist either. I was undecided, and I just stopped looking into that issue and tried not to think about it. I've mentioned before that I did the typical 90s kid thing where I started a GeoCities website about an interest that I had, and the interest that I landed on was the fact that evolution is stupid. On this website, I wanted to have pages dealing with every major facet of creationism, one of which is the age of the Earth. So I made the page, put up one of the classic under construction graphics, and started researching it, and then stopped, leaving that page untouched until the great GeoCities implosion of 2009.
However, I have also observed that many evolution-believing lay people, and even scientists, apparently don't understand what evolution is or is supposed to be either.
Now, when you say evolution-believing scientists, are you talking about scientists that specialize in something related to evolution? Because the thing about science is that there is no universal qualification. An astrophysicist might be an expert when it comes to matters related to astrophysics, but they are just as much of a layperson as I am when it comes to the biological sciences related to evolution. And while he's saying this, there is a flurry of headlines and random comments floating around. And in the case of the headlines, they've definitely just gone with the clickbaitiest ones, regardless of what the contents of the articles say. For instance, the headline, "Evolution may be purposeful and it's freaking scientists out," is from a Forbes article that is mostly concerned with countering the Dawkins selfish gene model of evolution. Basically, in Dawkins' view, genes are the things that are most concerned with survival, evolutionarily speaking. Preserve the organism, and the genes that organism contains will also be preserved. This has been used to explain things like altruistic behavior. Historically, humans would live in small tribes that were mostly made up of closely related individuals, so if one sacrificed their life to save another, most of their genes are the same, so the genes are preserved even though an organism containing those genes was not. The purpose of the gene is irrelevant, but the ones that facilitate survival of the organism, or its close family, would be better at surviving overall, and so evolution drove towards the development of all the fun traits that we see all over the place today. The Forbes article argues that selection acts on the organism as a whole with the purpose of protecting and adapting to changing environments, with the example given of our immune systems. The way our bodies learn to produce antibodies to fight off a virus is by triggering a flurry of rapid genetic mutation in the genes of our B cells, using trial and error until an antibody is produced that works. This process is very clearly not working towards the preservation of the genes, given that it relies on rapidly mutating them in order to work. There's more to it than that, of course, and the article is a fascinating read if you're interested, link is in the description, but at no point in that article does it say that researchers don't understand evolution. It's more about the lens through which evolution is viewed, and as with most things in biology, I'm going to put my money on this not being a black and white issue. There's some amount of selection at the genetic level, and some amount at the organism organism level, and some at the group level. This is an argument about degree, not fundamentals. The other headline they show is about a flightless parrot in New Zealand having evolved 2 feather colors that occur roughly equally in the population, and recent genetic research suggests that the second color evolved around the same time as a couple of now extinct predatory birds evolved, so the evolution of the second color was likely to help with camouflage. Not sure why that's even here when talking about people not understanding evolution, as that is very clearly researchers who understand evolution drawing conclusions based on the data that they have, not challenging evolutionary status quo, so sure? I mean, not sure. No. It doesn't belong there. Just take it out, Calvin.
Many times when critics show up to criticize our content, I will often post a simple statement: evolution has never been observed, which often sets off a firestorm of comments from evolution believers.
Understandably so, given that evolution has been observed. We've observed a single-celled species of algae evolve the trait of multicellularity in response to predation. 2 populations develop multicellularity independently in slightly different ways, and the trait was stably heritable for years even when the predator was removed. We've observed Bashir, a type of fish, evolve traits that helped it adapt to terrestrial living instead of aquatic living. We've observed a single strain of self-replicating RNA evolve into a miniature ecosystem with 5 strains interacting in a variety of ways. There were host-parasite relationships as well as cooperative relationships, where some RNA strains became dependent on the presence of other strains in order to replicate. Of course, the creationist objection will be that the algae is still algae, the fish is still a fish, the RNA is still RNA. Never mind that they will turn around and claim that the jump from single-celled organism to multicellularity can't be explained by evolution, despite us observing that exact thing in a lab, or that fish could never evolve to live terrestrially, despite the fact that an aquatic species of fish was successfully raised terrestrially in a lab. It doesn't matter if you show them exactly what they claim would be proof of evolution. The goalposts will just shift to the next closest objective that hasn't quite been observed yet, if they even acknowledge having seen it in the first place.
And I think that's because of the numerous ways in which evolution is, and has been, described over the years.
Well, evolution is a big topic, so there are numerous ways it can be described. Any pithy one-sentence description will contain oversimplification of one sort or another, and the different mechanisms of evolution work in different ways, so no matter how it is described, there will always be room for someone to say, well, actually, about something. That said, I am personally fond of the definition that says that evolution is the change in allele frequency in a population over successive generations. It's broad enough to capture pretty much everything that actually counts as evolution, but narrow enough to avoid calling one-off mutations evolution.
For example, textbooks will often define evolution as simply a change in gene frequencies and expression in a population over time.
Yep, that's basically the one that I just said. Different wording, means the same thing.
And if that were a legitimate definition of evolution, then I could call myself an evolutionist, because I know there are changes in gene frequencies in the population of various organisms all over the world occurring constantly.
Well then congratulations, you're an evolutionist.
But the big picture of what evolution means to the average person goes far beyond that.
Here's the thing though. You have literally spent the entire video up to this point complaining that the average person doesn't actually understand evolution. So to now pivot and say that the definition of evolution given by science textbooks is wrong because it doesn't match what the average person's understanding of evolution is, just kind of undermines your point. Like, yeah, I will agree that a person who doesn't think that definition fits evolution doesn't actually understand evolution, but it is not incumbent upon evolution to change to fit their understanding of it. It's incumbent upon them to learn more about it in order to gain a correct understanding of it.
And anyone who's seen a popular evolutionary diagram showing the supposed evolution of a fish transforming into an amphibian, then a reptile, then a mammal, etc., knows that all too well.
And you think those changes would not involve the changing of allele frequencies in those populations over time? Or is it more the fact that you don't think any amount of genetic change could account for those differences, despite the fact that we all have DNA that functions in the same way, using the same base pairs to produce the same amino acids? The only differences are the sequences themselves and the epigenetic factors affecting gene expression. You could take a human genome and, through changing one letter of the sequence at a time, end up with the genome for a mushroom, because the genomes are all made of the same stuff. So given that changing the genome over time is how these evolutionary changes would have happened, and that changing the genome over time is the definition of evolution that you just said you'd be willing to accept, what exactly is the problem here?
The story of evolution makes grand claims, popularized by the various incarnations of Charles Darwin's famous tree of life diagram, about how the supposed first living thing that came into being slowly changed and eventually became every living thing that has ever existed on the planet.
Yes. And the mechanism of that change is something that you just said you'd be willing to accept, leading me to once again ask, what is the problem here?
And that goes far beyond a simple comparison in gene frequencies in various organisms.
Why? There are some genes that all living organisms have in common, from the lowliest of bacteria to the grandest of trees, to the deadliest of mushrooms, to the swimmiest of the whales. And while the road is long, you can start with those shared genes, and through the adding, subtracting, or changing of one little base pair at a time, you can eventually get to the genome of any organism on the planet. Of course, this is a bit reductionist. That's not how it would play out in reality. Actually, come to think of it, I've made it harder than it is in reality. Because in reality, duplication is the thing that can happen, where anywhere from a single base pair to a single codon to a single gene to a collection of genes to the whole genome itself can be duplicated in one single event, which can get you a rather large leap of evolutionary progress in one fell swoop. And there are other methods by which larger change can happen rapidly. My point is that using the types of genetic changes that we know can happen, you can derive the genome of any organism that is alive today from the simple genetic core that they all still have in common that can be traced back to the last universal common ancestor.
Now, in contrast, some might simply describe the concept as evolution via natural selection.
No, this is where you are showing your lack of understanding. Natural selection is one mechanism through which evolution can act, but it is not a definition of evolution. It's an easy mistake to make, but one that should be avoided by someone claiming to have studied evolution in depth.
But creationists also believe in natural selection because it's observational science.
And yet, you don't believe in the evolution of multicellularity despite its direct observation in the lab. Weird double standard you've got there.
And it's also an integral mechanism in the biblical creation model.
Natural selection is completely absent from the Bible. It gets close to describing artificial selection occasionally, but I don't recall seeing any Bible verse describing how environmental conditions will change which traits are dominant in a population.
So how can it be used as proof of evolution?
It's not proof of evolution. As I already said, it is a mechanism of evolution. Evolution is the change in allele frequencies over successive generations. Natural selection is one of the driving forces that can result in such changes.
And it's not as if creationists have only recently adopted natural selection as some revisionist history panderers have accused us of.
I've never seen anyone accuse creationists of only recently adopting natural selection. Quite the contrary, the complaint is normally that creationists don't understand how an acceptance of natural selection is itself acceptance of evolution. Because, yeah, all of us on my side of the fence are perfectly aware that creationists who believe in Noah's flood have to accept evolution on a scale that even the most ardent of atheist evolutionists would say is way too fast. So we're not surprised that you accept natural selection. If anything, the surprise is that you accept such a radically rapid evolution while simultaneously denying evolution.
You see, many people believe it was Charles Darwin who came up with the theory of natural selection that was put forth in his book, Origin of Species.
Every major scientific breakthrough that we generally attribute to one person had people who were working out the details before that person put the final piece of the puzzle together. That's not to say that people like Darwin weren't worthy of recognition for their accomplishments, but rather to point out that they were standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. So no, not every single aspect of evolution that was presented in Darwin's book was exclusively discovered by Darwin. But also, who fucking cares? Evolution is true whether it was Darwin who first discovered natural selection or not. Evolution don't care which humans figured it out. Evolution just gonna do what evolution does.
Few realize that there's historical documentation stating he popularized the idea by borrowing it from several others, including the biblical creationist Edward Blyth.
A lot of scientists in the 1800s were creationists, including Charles Lyell, who's frequently maligned by creationists because of his discovery and promotion of the principle of uniformitarianism. So yeah, who cares that he was a creationist? Darwin wrote to Blyth in 1855 asking for his input on what would later be called natural selection. Blyth hadn't quite worked it out, but had written on the subject of artificial selection and considered that a similar process happens in nature, but which returns artificially selected animals back to their natural forms. When he received Darwin's letter asking for input, he responded by saying that he is, quote, "much gratified to learn that a subject in which I have always felt the deepest interest has been undertaken by one so competent to treat of it in all its bearings." So it's not like Darwin stole credit for the idea of natural selection. This is a guy that actively helped Darwin develop the idea of natural selection. Also, I'm not even going to get into the fact that natural selection in one form or another has been known about since at least the time of Aristotle and Empedocles, with Blyth and Darwin adding on to an already existing pool of knowledge rather than creating it from scratch. But it is worth mentioning that while Blyth was a Christian who believed that humans were created as is before Darwin came along, after Darwin published Origin of Species, Blyth not only came to accept that humans had themselves evolved, he actually suggested to Darwin that humans would have evolved from an ape that is similar to a gibbon. So are you going to acknowledge that Darwin's work, including that which built upon Blyth's work, ended up changing Blyth's opinion about creation? On top of that, even before Blyth gave up on creationism, he was never an evolution-denying young Earth creationist. To quote an article he wrote for the Magazine of Natural History in 1837, "There is every reason to infer that the human species was the last act of creation upon this world, and that it will continue to be so until its removal. It is needless to add that a prodigious lapse of time is here required, and to judge from data which the past history of the globe abundantly furnishes in legible records wherever we turn our eyes, to judge from the progressiveness of human intellect and the long, long while that must yet transpire ere man can hope to assume that rank as a consistent being for which his faculties clearly show that he was intended, the duration of his existence upon this planet would appear likely to bear proportion to that immense period that the globe will continue fitted for his reception, a period it may be presumed that will abundantly suffice to alternate the land and sea as we know has repeatedly happened heretofore." And so on and so on. I've wondered this before, but it bears repeating. When was the non-run-on sentence invented? Like, even this guy's title was a run-on sentence. This article was called "On the Psychological Distinctions Between Man and All the Other Animals and the Consequent Diversity of Human Influence over the Inferior Ranks of Creation from Any Mutual and Reciprocal Influence Exercised Among the Latter." Like, God, like, be less verbose, man. And this is me talking here. My point is that he fully believed in an old Earth with plenty of time for large-scale geologic change to take place, even if he did believe that human beings were themselves a fairly recent creation.
One can look up copies of the Magazine of Natural History from 1835 and 1837. Available online in PDF form.
Oh, would you look at that? He's showing the title of the exact article that I just quoted to show that Blyth's position regarding creation is incompatible with Calvin's. That's actually kind of annoying because it took me a while to find it, and it was right there all along. Anyway, I wonder if he'll address this discrepancy or if he'll just ignore it. Spoiler, he's gonna ignore it.
And read several articles by Blyth describing the process of natural selection. And remember, Darwin had only just returned from his 5-year voyage in which he was collecting specimen samples on board the Beagle in October of 1836. And so he had not yet fully formulated his evolutionary ideas.
And then he wrote a letter to Blyth asking for clarification, since Darwin was well aware of his work, and Blyth happily obliged. I failed to see the problem, and also failed to see the relevance to the point that Calvin is ostensibly trying to make. Why would it matter who first thought of natural selection when asking the question of if it's a thing that happens? Actually, I'm off track. I guess this is relevant to Calvin's point. He's trying to say that creationists have always accepted it, and he's doing so by appealing to someone who would laugh at Calvin's view of creation that requires ignoring basically the entire of the geologic record of the Earth.
So this was all in print well over 20 years before Darwin published Origin of Species.
Shocking news. Scientists built upon the work of previous scientists rather than inventing everything independently. Calvin, in this video, you are supposed to be showing us that you have an in-depth understanding of evolution. But so far, you are demonstrating that you don't even have a superficial understanding of how scientific progress is, and always has been, made. This is such a basic fact of how science works that there's actually a tongue-in-cheek scientific law called Stigler's Law of Eponymy, which states that no scientific discovery is named after its original discoverer. Hubble's law was first derived by Georges Lemaitre. Boyle's law was first noted by Richard Townley and Henry Power. The Fibonacci sequence has been around in Indian mathematics about 1500 years prior to Fibonacci's existence. Stigler's law is itself an example of Stigler's law. Robert K. Merton described it in 1968 and dubbed it the Matthew effect. Mark Twain described it in 1903. And that's not even close to an exhaustive list of people that came up with a similar principle. So how about instead of complaining that Darwin built on the ideas of other scientists, we just deal with the actual facts of the matter, Or do you need to distract from the facts in order to make it seem like you're saying more than you are? Because I notice that you still haven't mentioned that Blythe would have disagreed with your stance on creation, or that Blythe later came to accept not only the theory of evolution in general, but also specifically the evolution of the human species. Now, I'm just going to skip the rest of this segment. He essentially accuses Darwin of plagiarism, but Blythe and Darwin corresponded regularly, both before and after Origin was published. And while I haven't read every single letter, it all seems quite friendly, not at all like someone who is upset that Darwin stole his work without giving him credit. Blythe seems perfectly happy to have Darwin build on his ideas. Maybe Darwin did borrow too liberally from Blythe for modern plagiarism standards, but Blythe didn't seem bothered by it, and it has no bearing on the truth of evolution either way, so I'm done with this particular topic.
Regardless, I often enjoy reminding evolutionists that as far as natural selection goes, we understand it very well. After all, we creationists thought of it first.
Only if by creationist you mean ancient Greek philosopher. Which you don't. You actually mean guy who, if he were alive today, would be more likely to be found writing articles for Biologos than Answers in Genesis. And given the fact that AIG has a plethora of articles all about how horrible they think Biologos is, I don't think Calvin's smugness at claiming an evolution-believing and old earth-accepting Christian as a creationist is warranted.
You see, along with most other creationists that had gone before him, such as Carolus Linnaeus, the Swedish biologist who essentially formalized our modern classification system of naming organisms, Blythe recognized the God of the Bible as the creator who had designed the original kinds of creatures to be able to adapt and survive in a post-fall world. Natural selection was therefore seen as the mechanism that would explain how the limited number of animal kinds God sent on board Noah's Ark would then have been able to speciate after the flood and account for the numerous variety of modern animals we see today.
Except natural selection alone can't account for that because it doesn't operate fast enough to get from the 1,500 or so kinds that AIG claims were on the Ark to the estimated 6.5 million land species that exist today in only 4,000 years. That would require that at least 4.5 new species evolve every single day, and have done so consistently for the past 4,000 years. Of course, they get around this by claiming not to need any insects or arachnids on the Ark. They don't have the breath of life in them, see? Because they don't breathe using lungs. They have spiracles along their bodies that take oxygen directly into their trachea system, which definitely isn't a lung, and obviously when the Bible said that Noah was taking everything that had the breath of life in it, it was referring to having a specific organ that facilitates the gas exchange, not everything that breathes air. And just go ahead and ignore the fact that one verse before that, it specifies that Noah is taking the creeping things on the Ark, and that these creeping things are a separate category from the livestock, beasts, birds, and winged creatures. Anyway, if they leave the bugs behind on the grounds that they don't breathe the breath of life, then we wind up with another conundrum. Marine mammals do breathe the breath of life right into those big old lungs that they got. There are also some species of fish that have lung organs. So did Noah have an aquarium section on the Ark? The verse saying that all the flesh in which there was the breath of life went into the Ark makes no exception for marine species, which seems like a bit of an oversight. And sure, creationists will claim that marine species didn't need to be on the Ark because they can survive in water. They ignore the fact that dumping that much rain into the ocean will decrease the salinity to a point where most things that live in salt water would be unable to survive. So yes, they do need to be on the Ark. And that's not just marine mammals, that's all the fish and crustaceans and coral and whatnot as well.
All according to their original kind, what we would consider to be around the family level today.
Notice that he had to say it's around the family level rather than being specific about it. That's because as soon as they try to get specific, we can point to examples of evolution that transcend that level, and existing taxonomy becomes difficult because there are creatures included in the same family, taxonomically speaking, but which creationists need to pretend are not related, like weasels, badgers, and otters, all of which are members of the Mustelidae family.
Natural selection is a process that occurs when varieties in the offspring of various organisms, due to the built-in variety of pre-existing genetic information already inside them, are produced.
Correct, except for his caveat about the already built-in genetic information thing. Natural selection does work with existing variation, yes, and while the variation can sometimes come in the form of different alleles that already exist, sometimes it comes in the form of a mutation that produces a new variation. The ability to digest lactose, for instance, arose from a mutation that occurred between 2 and 20,000 years ago. Then, natural selection was able to increase its prevalence in areas that depended upon the consumption of milk, like Europe. So yeah, technically speaking, the natural selection wasn't at work until the variation was there, but the variations are not immutable immutable characteristics. They can change, and new variations can arise through a number of processes.
And if the specific combination of genes that are expressed result in ways that confer a survival benefit to the organism in the environment they're in, such as long-haired varieties in cold regions or short-haired ones in warm areas, those with that specific genetic makeup will be more likely to create more offspring and become the dominant kind in that area.
Finally, he said something correct. But he doesn't get any points for it because that was technically the second half of his explanation of natural selection, which was critically flawed due to his unnecessary caveating about where the variation comes from.
When these new varieties continue to reproduce amongst themselves, they may become even more specific in their looks or behavior, etc., as they may not have access to potential mates with a wider variety of genetics. This means that the new population will have less variety of genetic information than the original parent population did.
Yeah. That's actually how scientists are able to determine that some species have gone through a bottleneck event. Fun fact, do you know what we don't find universally in all species? Evidence of a bottleneck event 4,000 years ago. That would be a universal and easy to detect genetic marker, but it's just not there.
Therefore, natural selection is not a creative process. It can only select from what pre-exists. Genes that aren't in the gene pool of any particular kind of creature can't be selected for, so natural selection never produces anything truly new.
And as natural selection is one mechanism of evolution, but is not itself the entirety of the theory of evolution, that is fine. It doesn't need to be a creative force. We've got mutations and epigenetics and phenotypic plasticity for that. And now I shall skip the rest of this section as well, because he just goes on and on about how natural selection doesn't make new traits, which isn't an issue because nobody who understands the basics of how evolution works says that it does.
Take the aforementioned peppered moth as an example. It's been referred to gushingly by evolutionists as not only the poster child of Darwinian evolution, but also as the prize horse in our stable in terms of evidence of evolution via natural selection.
You know what? I'm going to skip this section as well, as I covered it in great detail last time I responded to Calvin. It's all the same points as last time, sometimes even with identical graphics as he makes them.
You see, Matthews, a committed evolutionist, understood that if evolution were true, then at one time there were creatures without lungs. Then lungs evolved. At one time there were creatures without wings. Then wings evolved. There were creatures without echolocation. Then that ability and all of its required genetic software and hardware, so to speak, evolved, etc.
Yep. None of that is in dispute. And keep in mind, this is still in his peppered moth section. He just stopped talking about it long enough to make a different point, that these traits are features that would not have been present in the last universal common ancestor, and so had to evolve at some point. It's not really relevant to the peppered moth example, unless you're looking to promote the misunderstanding that natural selection is the whole of evolution.
Evolution is supposed to explain where all the new stuff came from. Ultimately, evolution has to demonstrate where the acquisition of new abilities, forms, functions, and features came from.
Yep, and it does. Just because you refuse to acknowledge it doesn't mean the explanation isn't there. Now, at this point, as I was writing yet another comment about how he's supposed to have studied evolution in depth for this video, as that is the very premise presented in the title, I remembered that one of my complaints against them last time I covered them was the fact that whoever is writing the titles over at AIG doesn't seem to be concerned with making the titles match the video. They just want the clicks. So it occurs to me now that whoever wrote the script that Calvin is reading did not necessarily have that premise in mind. Title guy just saw a bunch of fancy books piled around and thought, gee whiz, guy with that many books around and must be real smart. So I've once again been distracted by their penchant for lying for the sake of clicks. At least this time it's not quite as egregious as saying they're destroying all of the latest proof of evolution in a video that only touches on one single piece of evolution from the 21st century. Anyway, Calvin's going back to the moths now, so I'm going back to skipping.
So, how many evolution believers really understand evolution?
Depends what you mean by evolution believer, I suppose. I'm sure there are plenty of people who accept evolution because they were taught it in school, but ultimately they don't think about it much because they just don't care one way or the other. And sure, you might even trick those people into thinking that evolution and natural selection are synonyms, so that when you point out that natural selection doesn't create new traits, that might throw them for a loop. But you being deceptive in order to trick lay people doesn't actually call the truth of evolution into question.
Of course, if you've been keeping up to date on the whole peppered moth story, Majerus later flipped the script and said he'd done research of his own that vindicates Ketterwell's original conclusions, even if he used improper methods to divine them.
So the guy you cited as having completely demolished the peppered moth story, proudly proclaiming the whole time that he's an evolutionist, so even evolutionists think this is wrong, actually changed his mind on it? And you think that helps your side here?
And some evolutionists, such as Steve Connor, the science editor for the Indie, the British liberal-leaning online newspaper called The Independent, have tried to use the situation to make it seem like, once again, those silly creationists just don't understand evolution.
Well, it's either that or they're lying about it. I'm already convinced that you specifically are lying about it, given the way you have to twist what your sources are saying in order to make your points, but I'm sure there are some out there who honestly don't understand it. And really, the likely reason they don't understand it is because it was explained to them by someone like Calvin, who doesn't seem capable of honestly representing anything.
He wrote, "Creationists smelt blood. The story of the peppered moth became a story of how Darwinism itself was flawed, with its best-known example being based on fiddled data." Quoting Majerus, he said, "The peppered moth story is easy to understand because it involves things that we are familiar with. Vision and predation and birds and moths and pollution and camouflage and lunch and death. That's why the anti-evolution lobby attacks the peppered moth story. They're frightened that too many people will be able to understand."
Not sure I entirely agree, but yeah, it is an easy to understand story that deals with the kinds of things that people are familiar with. As long as you don't muddle the definitions of evolution and natural selection, it is very simple. But Calvin is over here all like, hey, this thing that they say is an example of natural selection is only an example of natural selection, nothing more. Therefore, evolution is false because they say natural selection is evolution. Don't ask where they say that, just trust me when I say that they say that.
Now, do you see what he's trying to do here? By making it seem as if creationists were only focusing on whether the original research was flawed or not, he's saying that creationists are obfuscating the real argument.
I mean, that is a thing that creationists do all the damn time. Just look at the Miller-Urey experiment. It was an experiment from 70 years ago. There have been dozens of follow-up experiments since then, but creationists only ever talk about Miller-Urey and complain that they got the composition of the early Earth atmosphere wrong, as though that hadn't been corrected in subsequent experiments.
And that they're trying to lure people away from truly understanding the peppered moth study.
Honestly, I don't care if you truly understand the study or not, but it is a fact that creationists misrepresent it, and I'd like it if people could at least understand that.
Which, again, is supposedly the best-known example of Darwinism, and perhaps why they are so defensive of it.
What is Darwinism, Calvin? We've been talking about evolution this whole time, and as I've mentioned already, the peppered moths are an example of natural selection, which is a part of evolution, but not the whole thing. But now you're bringing Darwinism into it, as though that's a meaningful term at this point? You started this video off talking definitions, wanting to clarify what is meant by which words. Well, what is your definition of Darwinism? Or is that just a buzzword meant to make you sound like you're actually saying something when you're not?
However, far from wanting the average high schooler or college student to know what the data shows, we wish everyone would come to understand it fully.
No, you don't. And I know that you don't because you don't present it fully. You literally had to pretend that Darwin was stealing research from a creationist in order to throw shade on evolution, all while ignoring the fact that the creationist in that scenario wasn't even close to what you would consider to be a creationist and was actively participating in helping Darwin develop the concept of natural selection. If that's the kind of lying you have to do to make creationism seem like maybe it's true if you don't bother checking creationist sources, then yeah, I can't say I see much hope for creationism being true.
The only point creationists made regarding the doctored evidence in the moth experiments was that evolutionists have been caught fudging their data to fit their story many, many times now. So people should be cautious of accepting it without serious consideration.
Projection much? I don't think I've ever seen a video where Calvin is not obviously fudging his data. And I'd encourage you to go through my sources to make sure that I'm not doing that either. Actually read them though. Don't just look at the quotes that I've pulled or the screenshots that I've shared. Read through the sources. I promise you, at most, you might find something that I have misunderstood at some point, but you won't find anything close to the egregious misrepresentations that we see from Calvin every time I cover him.
So, who exactly is it that doesn't understand evolution?
Creationists. Because they get their information about evolution from sources like Answers in Genesis, who are actively misrepresenting it.
No one has observed evolution in action.
Well, I gave a bunch of examples at the beginning, which I have never seen Calvin even acknowledge, so draw what conclusions you can from that.
And yet countless believers in the story of evolution, both lay people and scientifically literate specialists, claim to have done so.
Maybe you should ask yourself, why is it that you disagree with specialists about the field in which they specialize, rather than assuming that because their findings don't conform to your personal expectations for their field, their findings must be wrong?
And yet, when pressed, most of the scientists will admit that big picture evolution is not demonstrable, while still citing specific circumstances like new flu bug strains or pesticide or antibiotic resistance, etc.
How is that not big picture evolution? The reason we need updated flu and COVID shots every year is because evolution is happening. The reason we're keeping an eye on the spread of avian flu through the livestock populations is because, well, it doesn't currently spread easily in humans. Some minor mutations could cause it to become more infectious. Same with antibiotic and pesticide resistance. That is evolution in action. But I guess the only thing that'll ever satisfy Calvin is if he were to see a cat born with fully functioning wings or something. Evolution isn't true unless you can see something that, according to the theory of evolution, is impossible. Seems a bit disingenuous.
And touting fancy-sounding mechanisms like genetic drift, non-random mating, speciation, gene flow, founder's theory, etc., which all fall under the umbrella of examples of natural selection or of defective genetic mutations.
Nope. Certainly they are related to natural selection, but they are distinct processes. Also, a mutation in and of itself is not defective. It's just a mutation. Sometimes it will do nothing. Sometimes it will be detrimental. Sometimes it will be beneficial. Sometimes a mutation that would be beneficial in one environment will be detrimental in another, and vice versa. Attaching a value judgment to the concept of mutation just is not warranted.
None of which have ever been observed to evolve anything.
Lactose tolerance, resistance to malaria, a new organ in a species of lizard, improved sense of smell in fruit flies, ability to metabolize citrate in E. coli, multicellularity in algae, fish living terrestrially. All of these are examples of mutations that provided a benefit, and they are all subjects that I've dealt with multiple times on my channel. Get with the program, Calvin.
No, we understand what evolution is supposed to be and to be able to do.
Yep. And you're lying about it in order to promote creationism, presumably for that sweet, sweet tax-free ARC money.
It's just that none of the things that evolutionists point to as evidence for evolution actually accomplish what evolution is supposed to.
To rephrase slightly, my expectations of evolution are inaccurate, and since evolution does not meet my inaccurate expectations, it must be false.
None of these examples ever create anything new. They just demonstrate either reshuffled varieties or broken and damaged versions of what already existed.
Is it broken and damaged if it gives the organism an advantage? I don't consider my ability to drink milk to be damaging to me, but I have that ability because I am descended from a mutant.
What the story of evolution actually depends on is an impressive amount of imagination, not observational science. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear it constantly in their explanations of how this supposedly turned into that over millions of years, and yet no one has ever observed anything close to that occurring.
Oftentimes those "this is how this turned into that" stories are based on organisms that are still around today. The eye is an excellent example. The eye likely developed by first being a patch of light-sensitive cells. At some point a mutation occurred to make the patch somewhat concave, which gave a sense of direction to the light it was detecting. A deeper cavity gave a more accurate sense of direction, so mutations that gave it more depth were selected for, and eventually it became a pinhole camera type of eye. Another mutation could cause a transparent bit to grow in front of the hole, providing a rudimentary lens. Any covering is better than none, so it need not be a lens that is fully capable of focusing, it just needs to be something. But further mutations provide the ability to slightly contract or expand the lens, and now the ability to focus is there, and so on and so forth. Now, left on its own, this would just be conjecture, but the thing is, there are organisms alive today with eyes that are equivalent to every step in this process. So we know that small improvements on the eye are all both useful and possible. Is that exactly the process that it took? Not necessarily, but it is a plausible process that is bolstered by the current existence of organisms with the kinds of eyes required in that process.
Now, at this point in the argument, many evolutionists often retreat to elephant hurling, claiming that if creationists took into account the entire body of evidence from the fossil record, the geologic column, DNA studies, ape-man skulls, dinosaurs, etc., and put it all together, then we'd understand the evidence for evolution is simply overwhelming.
While that is a true statement, it isn't necessary. I'd rather just point out where you are wrong and issue corrections. Honestly, that sounds more like how apologists argue that there actually is evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Sure, the woman discovering the tomb by itself is bad evidence, and the account of the 500 witnesses is also bad evidence, and sure, there's little to no evidence that any of the disciples were martyred for their beliefs, but if you add them all up, then apparently 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals 1 somehow. But in evolution's case, all the individual bits are actually good evidence. The peppered moths are objectively an example of natural selection in action. Calvin himself admits as much. He just refuses to acknowledge that scientists are well aware of the distinction between evolution and natural selection. Mutations have been observed that provide a benefit to their organism. That is an objective fact that Calvin dismisses by calling them corruptions, without explaining why a mutation cannot be beneficial. And so on and so forth. There is plenty of evidence for evolution, which, when taken as a whole, make the conclusion that evolution is a real thing that happens all but certain.
In order to create the appearance of the story of evolution as having some semblance of credibility, evolutionists sometimes water down the definition to the point that it seems any change in living things, past or present, can be co-opted into the definition.
You still haven't actually given your definition of evolution. Evolution that you would actually consider to be the version that you claim is impossible. You presented a couple of the accepted definitions and then agreed with them, but insisted that that's not really evolution because reasons. So what do you think the actual definition of evolution, the kind of evolution that you say you don't accept, is? And how can you possibly claim to be arguing against evolution if you refuse to even define it in a way that someone who specializes in an evolution-related field would agree with?
A perfect example is the definition of evolution used by Dr. Eugenie Scott, former executive director of the rather pretentious-sounding and evolution-defending National Center for Science Education. By the way, notice her target audience when using the definition. The big idea is that living things, species, are related to one another through common ancestry from earlier forms that differed from them. Darwin called this descent with modification, and it is still the best definition of evolution we can use, especially with members of the general public and with young learners.
Yeah, it's easy to understand, and it encapsulates the general idea without getting too technical. So that is a good definition for lay people who only need a basic understanding of the concept. What is the problem?
Of course, under this definition, the very act of procreation between sexually reproducing organisms could be dubbed as evidence of evolution.
Yep, and it is. I have kids. My kids are similar to me, but not identical. Their alleles are slightly different from mine. So over successive generations, the allele frequency in our household has changed. Boom! Evolution! But again, this is one of those definitions that you will agree with before going on to say that you don't actually accept evolution. You're in quite the catch-22, and if you want out of it, you need to be able to define the type of evolution that you refuse to believe in, and do so in a way that would actually be an acceptable definition for experts in the field. Then we can talk specifics about that form of evolution and examine its evidence. But until then, you have just ended up agreeing with evolution and then saying, yeah, but that's not actually evolution. But you can't define it in a way that would work for this purpose, because that would reveal just how disingenuous you had to be in order to deny evolution.
Because the offspring of all living things are obviously related to their ancestors and differ from them to some degree. No wonder the average person that evolutionists like Scott are targeting doesn't understand evolution. If virtually any change in living thing can be cited as proof of evolution, of course the average young person will grow up thinking that the so-called evidence for it is overwhelming. And no wonder so many of them keep showing up in our comments section saying, you just don't understand evolution.
Well, if I'm generous and say that every word you have said in this video represented your honest opinion on the matter, yes, that is correct. You don't understand evolution. But at this point, we know that's not the case. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from DogUMead8883, who says, evolution requires mutations to add new information, not destroy/corrupt already existing ones. It's not whether the mutation is beneficial or not, it's what is happening at the molecular level. Is it a loss or gain? All we observe mutations doing is corrupting and deleting already existing information, beneficial or not. To get something like a dinosaur to a bird, you need new genetic information to be added. And I just thought this comment went so perfectly with Calvin's video, because ultimately the end goal for organizations like Answers in Genesis is this. Clearly, this commenter has learned everything they know about mutations from creationist organizations. Otherwise, they would know that quantifying genetic information isn't as simple as they seem to think it is. On top of that, duplications are a type of mutation that we have observed happening on a number of occasions. When a duplication happens, by any meaningful metric, information has been added. So however you decide to quantify information, duplication mutations will increase the amount of information, and also insertions. But because they only ever hear people like Calvin talk about how mutations are a corruption or a degradation of information, they likely aren't even aware that insertions or duplications are even a thing. So Calvin, if you want people to actually understand evolution, stop lying to them about it. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorship manager, Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the lies told by the creationist that is my channel. If you'd like to feign indignance, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! I can hear that it's still echoey. I put up my acoustic panels. Why is it still echoey? Need more panels. Need more panels. Gary! Okay. Prop Gary up with R2-D2. You know, it occurs to me that if I'm imitating Calvin, I should start all of my sentences with a mouth click and a deep breath. Deep, loud breath. Like, can't even do it. That's how he starts all his sentences. It drives me fucking nuts, and I'm so sorry, Piper, that you have to edit that.